There's a moment in the mid-1960s where you can almost feel the ground shift beneath the music industry. Suddenly, one band from Liverpool didn't just top the charts, they were the charts. Radio stations played them. Television broadcast them. Teenagers all over the world bought everything they released the day it came out. And while the world was busy falling in love with the Fab Four, dozens of other artists were quietly watching their biggest moments get absorbed, blocked, or simply buried. These are the 10 Beatles songs that destroyed other artists. Number 10, I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. By late 1963, the Dave Clark Five were on a serious roll. The band from Tottenham had worked hard to build a following in the UK club circuit, and when they put out a stomping, drum-heavy single called Glad All Over, it started flying off the shelves at a rate Dave Clark himself described as around 180,000 copies a day at its peak. In January 1964, it climbed to the top of the UK singles chart, and it got there by knocking I Want to Hold Your Hand out of the number 1 spot. That was supposed to be the turning point. The British press went wild, running headlines suggesting that the Dave Clark Five might actually dethrone the Beatles as Britain's top band. For a brief week or two, it genuinely looked like a contest. But then the Beatles went to America. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9, 1964, was watched by an estimated 73 million viewers, a staggering figure for the time, representing roughly 40% of the entire U.S. population. I Want to Hold Your Hand shot to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 7 weeks. The song didn't just win the American market, it opened the door for the entire British invasion and made it possible for UK acts to be taken seriously in the United States at a scale that had never existed before. And who got to walk through that door right behind the Beatles? The Dave Clark Five. The irony is that the DC Five had a genuinely strong run in America. They ended up with 17 top 40 hits on the Billboard chart and made 18 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, more than any other British act of the era. They also became the second British invasion group to appear on the show, following the Beatles by just a few weeks. In 1964 alone, they released 8 singles in the US, several of which made the top 20. But the narrative was always the same. The Beatles were the headline, and everyone else was the opening act. Glad All Over peaked at number 6 in the United States, a respectable chart position in any other era. But in the spring of 1964, with Beatles records occupying the top 5 simultaneously, it amounted to a footnote. Dave Clark's band never got to be the story. Not really. Glad All Over had knocked the Beatles off the top in Britain, but by the time the world caught on to what was happening in pop music, I Want to Hold Your Hand had already written the rules for the next 5 years. The Dave Clark Five were talented, popular, and hardworking, and they still ended up in the shadows. Hey, you got that something. Number 9, She Loves You by the Beatles. In the autumn of 1963, Jerry and the Pacemakers were doing something no act had ever done before. Their first 3 singles, How Do You Do It, I Like It, and You'll Never Walk Alone, had all gone to number 1 on the UK singles chart consecutively. It was a historic achievement, and You'll Never Walk Alone in particular felt like more than just a pop song. It was emotional, sweeping, and built for something bigger than radio. Producer George Martin had added strings to the arrangement, giving it a grandeur that the simple Rodgers and Hammerstein melody could support, but that very few pop acts of that era would have attempted. Then, She Loves You came along. The Beatles had already taken From Me to You to number 1 earlier in 1963, knocking Jerry's I Like It off the top in the process. Now, She Loves You came roaring back to reclaim that spot, displacing You'll Never Walk Alone from the chart summit in November 1963, after just 4 weeks at number 1. Both bands were from Liverpool. Both were managed by Brian Epstein at one point. Both recorded at EMI. The connection ran deep, but so did the gap in commercial trajectory. You'll Never Walk Alone went on to become one of the most beloved songs in British culture, though not as a pop chart entry. It was adopted by Liverpool Football Club as their anthem and eventually became a standard at grounds and sporting events across the country. Its life after the charts was richer than most number ones could ever claim, but its moment at the Pop Summit was cut short before it had a chance to settle in. Jerry Marsden and his band continued recording through the mid-1960s, but the heights of 1963 were never quite reached again. By 1965, the beat group era was shifting, and the pacemakers found themselves in a world the Beatles had largely redefined. The band that had made history with 3 consecutive number ones would be remembered, but always slightly behind the group that shared their city, their producer, and their manager. Number 8, Can't Buy Me Love, by the Beatles. The first week of April 1964 produced one of the most extraordinary moments in pop chart history. On April 4th, the Beatles held every single position in the Billboard Hot 100's Top 5, Can't Buy Me Love at number 1, Twist and Shout at 2, She Loves You at 3, I Want to Hold Your Hand at 4, and Please Please Me at 5. They also had 14 entries in the Top 100 that same week. It was a chart saturation that no act had ever achieved before, and none has achieved since, a record that stood until 2021, when rapper Drake placed his entire catalog on the chart following his deal with Republic Records. For everyone else trying to break through in the spring of 1964, the timing could not have been worse. A young Texas singer named Terry Stafford had released a recording of Suspicion, a song originally cut by Elvis Presley for his 1962 album Potluck, and it was climbing fast. Stafford's voice bore such an uncanny resemblance to Presley's that many listeners assumed it was Elvis himself. Radio DJs were confused. Listeners debated it on call-in shows. The comparison generated genuine curiosity and drove record sales. Suspicion climbed steadily and eventually peaked at number 3 in April 1964. But it spent its entire chart life in a sea of Beatles records. When it finally hit its highest point, Can't Buy Me Love was still at the top, and the band held multiple positions in the surrounding territory. There simply wasn't room for anyone else to breathe. Elvis himself released his version of Suspicion that same year, hoping to capitalize on renewed interest in the song. But it peaked at number 103. The man who had been the undisputed king of American pop music just 3 years earlier couldn't make a dent in the chart climate the Beatles had created. If Elvis couldn't break through, Terry Stafford certainly wasn't going to. Stafford never had another hit anywhere near that scale. He had a handful of minor country chart entries in later years, but Suspicion was his commercial peak, and it arrived at the exact moment in history when one band from Liverpool was occupying every available inch of the pop chart landscape. Number 7, A Hard Day's Night, by the Beatles. When A Hard Day's Night topped the charts in the summer of 1964, it achieved something that had never happened before. The Beatles simultaneously held the number 1 album and number 1 single in both the United States and the United Kingdom. The film of the same name, directed by Richard Lester, was also a massive critical and commercial success. It was the first time a single act had locked down that many pillars of the entertainment industry at once. In that same window, one of the most promising new soul acts in America was trying to break through. The Four Tops had signed with Motown in 1963, and in 1964 they were beginning to find their footing with the label's songwriting and production team. Their debut Motown single, Baby I Need Your Loving, was a genuinely strong piece of music, polished, emotionally direct, and driven by Levi Stubbs' powerful lead vocal. It climbed to number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the fall of 1964. For any other season, that would have been a meaningful chart debut. But 1964 was not any other season. Radio stations across America were still overwhelmingly focused on the British invasion, with the Beatles at its absolute center. A new Motown act didn't have the promotional machinery or the media momentum to compete for the same level of attention that was being directed at every new Beatles release, every Beatles interview, every Beatles film review. The oxygen in the room had been rerouted. The Four Tops eventually got their full due. By 1965, I Can't Help Myself, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, had gone to number 1, and by 1966, Reach Out I'll Be There was one of the most acclaimed singles of the decade. Levi Stubbs became regarded as one of the great voices in soul music. The band's legacy is secure, but those early months in 1964 were harder than they had any reason to be. Baby, I Need Your Loving deserved a wider runway, and the Beatles had built a wall at the end of the airstrip. Number 6. Help by the Beatles. By the summer of 1965, the folk rock movement was gaining real momentum in America. The Byrds had already taken Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man to number 1, and a new generation of artists was finding a bridge between the acoustic folk tradition and the electric energy that had been reshaping pop music since the British invasion. The mood in the country was shifting too. This was the year the Vietnam War began its most significant escalation, and the music was starting to reflect that. One of those artists was Barry Maguire. He'd been a founding member of the New Christy Minstrels before going solo, and his debut solo single, Eve of Destruction, was something else entirely. Written by P.F. Sloan, it was a raw, urgent protest record, spoken almost as much as sung, that felt directly tied to the anxieties coursing through the country. The war, the bomb, civil rights, generational frustration. Maguire packed all of it into one relentless 2.5-minute song. Eve of Destruction climbed to number 1 in September 1965, spending a single week at the top. The following week, the Beatles' Help pushed it aside and took the spot. The contrast between the two records could hardly have been greater. Eve of Destruction was bleak, confrontational, and politically charged. Help was melodically irresistible, driven by energy and personality, with a sense of urgency that was personal rather than political. Both were legitimate expressions of their moment. But in a radio landscape still largely controlled by top 40 formats, there was only room for one kind of intensity at the top. Several radio stations banned Eve of Destruction outright, citing its content. The controversy generated attention, but it also limited the song's reach. Maguire never came close to matching its commercial success with anything he recorded afterward. The song has endured as a document of its era, one of the most recognizable protest records ever made, but its 1 week at number 1 was all it got before the Beatles moved in. Number 5. Eleanor Rigby / Yellow Submarine by the Beatles.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in a jug.
In the summer of 1966, the Beatles released a double A-side single, Yellow Submarine, backed with Eleanor Rigby. At the time, Billboard still ranked both sides of a 45 separately, which meant the two songs were effectively in competition with each other on the chart. The result was unusual. Yellow Submarine peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, held back, in part, by its own flip side, Eleanor Rigby, which reached number 11. Had Billboard counted the combined sales of both sides together, as they later began to do, the single would almost certainly have topped the chart outright. But the casualty in all of this wasn't just internal. The song sitting at number 1 that summer was Summer in the City by the Lovin' Spoonful, a terrific piece of New York street heat rock that deserved its moment. And immediately following the Beatles at number 2, artists like the Troggs and their hit With a Girl Like You were also caught in the current. Meanwhile, the Supremes, already one of Motown's biggest acts, had You Can't Hurry Love climbing the charts at the same time. That song actually held Yellow Submarine to its number 2 peak for a period, making it one of the rare instances in the 1960s where another act genuinely stood between a Beatles record and the top spot. It was one of the only times the Supremes had the better of the Beatles in a direct chart battle.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in a jug.
Number 4. Paperback Writer by the Beatles.
Paperback Writer.
In May 1966, the Rolling Stones were at number 1 with Paint It Black. It was one of their darkest and most ambitious singles, a minor-key, sitar-tinged piece of music that felt genuinely different from anything else on the radio. The song had reached the top of the Billboard Hot 100 on May 7, 1966, and it seemed like the Stones were finally establishing themselves as something more than just Britain's other band. 3 weeks later, the Beatles released Paperback Writer. It entered the American chart directly at number 1, displacing Paint It Black and beginning a 2-week run at the top. The Stones' moment was over before it had fully settled in. This kind of displacement happened repeatedly throughout the mid-1960s. The Rolling Stones were arguably the only act in the world with enough cultural weight to hold the attention of the same audience as the Beatles, and even they couldn't hold their ground at the top when the Fab Four released new material. The Stones, of course, survived. They went on to have one of the most enduring careers in rock history. But the pattern was hard to ignore. Whenever the Beatles decided to release something, the conversation shifted. Paint It Black deserved more than 2 weeks as the story of that spring. What it got instead was a quick exit. Number 3. All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. The summer of 1967 was one of the most musically abundant seasons of the decade. Album rock was flowering, Motown was at full strength, and the counterculture was producing some of its most lasting music. It was also the summer the Beatles performed All You Need Is Love on a global television broadcast linking 26 countries, and then released it as a single. It went to number 1 in both the UK and the US. The collateral damage was felt most sharply by Scott McKenzie, whose song, San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, was already climbing the charts. Written by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas and released in May 1967, it became the unofficial anthem of the Summer of Love, and the counterculture moment centered around that city. In the UK, it reached number 1. In the US, it peaked at number 4. The timing of All You Need Is Love put a ceiling on Mackenzie's already limited run in the American market. His career never produced another comparable hit. He remained best known for that one song, which, despite its cultural resonance, had to share the summer with a Beatles record that drew even more of the world's attention. San Francisco became a cultural artifact. Mackenzie mostly stepped away from the spotlight. The song found new life over the decades, but he never did.
All you need is love.
Number 2. Hey Jude by the Beatles.
Hey Jude, don't make it.
In the late summer of 1968, the Rascals were having one of the best years of their career. People Got to Be Free had been inspired by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, and it connected with listeners in a deep and immediate way. The song climbed to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in August 1968 and had real momentum behind it. Then the Beatles released Hey Jude on August 26, 1968. By the final week of September, Hey Jude had taken over the number 1 position, and People Got to Be Free was falling. The two songs spent weeks in the same stretch of the chart, but the Beatles' single had an advantage that almost nothing could overcome. It was a 7-minute-plus recording, the longest number 1 in US chart history up to that point, and it seemed to grow in scale the more people heard it. Hey Jude went on to spend 9 weeks at number 1. It was the best-selling single of 1968 and the biggest Beatles single of their entire career, according to Billboard. The Rascals never quite recovered that level of commercial momentum. People Got to Be Free was a genuinely important piece of music for its time, but in the year-end recaps and the longer sweep of music history, it was Hey Jude that defined the fall of 1968. The Rascals moment was real. It was just shorter than it deserved to be.
Hey Jude, don't make it.
Number 1. The Long and Winding Road by the Beatles.
Wild and windy night.
By the spring of 1970, the Beatles were finished. The band had already effectively broken apart. Individual members were recording separately, tensions were public, and the end was a matter of when, not if. The Long and Winding Road, produced under circumstances Paul McCartney famously objected to, became the group's final #1 single in the United States. It reached the top of the Billboard Hot 100 on June 13, 1970, and stayed there for 2 weeks. In the same stretch, a song called "Everything is Beautiful" by Ray Stevens had been climbing steadily and was performing well at the top of the chart. Stevens was a versatile performer, part novelty act, part genuine balladeer, and "Everything is Beautiful" was one of the most earnest and warmly received records of his career. It reached #1 in May 1970, before being displaced as "The Long and Winding Road" took over. The broader context mattered too. In the spring and summer of 1970, a large portion of the music industry's attention was consumed by the question of the Beatles' breakup, whether it was real, what it meant, who was at fault. Every major music publication was running the story, radio stations were debating it, and "The Long and Winding Road," arriving in the middle of that chaos, absorbed attention that might otherwise have been available for other artists. Ray Stevens had a long and successful career in country and novelty music, but "Everything is Beautiful" stood as one of his biggest mainstream moments, and even that got pulled into the orbit of the Beatles' final chapter. It was, in a way, a fitting end. The Beatles had been reshaping the chart landscape for 6.5 years. Even as they fell apart, they were still doing it.
Wild and windy night.
6.5 years, 20 #1 singles in the United States, 14 songs that never got to reach the top because there was simply no room at the inn. The Beatles didn't set out to destroy anyone. They were just that good. But the math of the charts doesn't care about intention. If they were at the top, everyone else was somewhere below. The artists in this video were all talented. Many of them had long careers and enduring music. But every one of them spent at least some part of the 1960s standing in a shadow that stretched from Liverpool all the way around the world. If this is the kind of music history you love, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more where this came from.